The wall or cliff upon which the pyramid was built has been carefully studied. There is no openings that have been found. The Sphinx has been pierced with rods throughout its entire body, but no openings have been found within it. And it, of course, the Sphinx was a living outcropping of rock. It was not built. The only thing that was built were the front paws. In other words, if it was true, did the initiation ceremony take place when the person was voluntarily out of the physical body? The ancient priests were able to function out of the body. This there can be no reasonable doubt. And it is also mentioned in a number of early Christian reports. Namely, that it was that it was possible for the invisible bodies of the individual to be separated from the visible without a loss of consciousness or a loss of intelligence, and that the invisible body could travel to distant places and could have various experiences. And many people believe this is a comparatively common happening in sleep, that the individual is not actually asleep spiritually, only physically, and that the superphysical vehicles are just as busy while he's asleep as when he is awake. But regardless of this particular point, it is possible that the initiations of the pyramid were given while the candidate was out of the physical body. If so, then there would be no problem of the difficulty of getting into the building. The superphysical vehicles could go through very easily. Another problem that arises in connection with the pyramid project is something that is coming along now, namely that the pyramid was some kind of a vibratory structure, radiating energy and having some strange virtue in itself, and that meditation upon the pyramidal shape produces certain changes in the human consciousness. The particular shape, angle, and tip of the pyramid, its proportions and so forth, having very definite significance. Now, this point is not original now. It is referred to in very ancient times, for it was believed and taught that in Egypt, it is earlier than Pythagoras of Samos, that is the 6th century B.C., the Egyptians represented their deities by symmetrical geometric solids, and that in the temples, the 5 perfect solids were used to represent the principal deities, that each of them with a different shape, a different proportion, and a different arrangement represented one of the deities, and that, most important of all, the contemplation of these forms had meaning, that the contemplation of the symmetric solids could heal disease, could expand consciousness, could relieve the mind of distress, and could calm the emotions. Each of these forms, then, was, in a sense, therapeutic, because perfect harmony is always therapeutic. If music as harmony can improve health, then we may say that the harmonic solids are a form of music captured in material like metal, stone, or crystals, and have the same effect as music, color, or any other therapeutic factor. Form and shape exercise a spiritual authority over the individual. Now, this was known to the Chinese, or at least believed by them, and we find traces of this in the I Ching. Most of all, however, we find in the Orient that painting and scenery, beautiful symbolic designs, mandalas, were particularly important in releasing the individual from the negative moods of life, that he was able to contemplate more fully, and by relaxing could take harmony into himself. One of the problems we face today is the constant pressure of inharmony. We live in a world in which very little is the way we wish it was. We are all constantly under the pressure of worry, anxiety, fear, despondency, irritation, aggravation. These things press in upon us all the time. We are also afflicted by the very appearance of our civilization. there is nothing more depressing than the average city. And there are very few things much more depressing than the average house, because people simply have not the insight or the understanding to build structures suitable to the release of their own consciousness. The individual concerned only with physical comfort may live in an environment which makes his spiritual nature completely uncomfortable. Also, public buildings now no longer have their foundation in the Dionysian artificers of old, who built buildings according to the laws of the gods and the geometry of nature. Today we build them largely to look like blocks of ice because that is the cheapest way to put them together. They cost millions as it is, but they have nothing. There is no warmth, there is no real beauty, but finally the average individual tries to put his own concept of beauty into them and looks at one of these atrocities and says it's wonderful. It's simply because he has become accustomed to something that was not right, until he finally accepts deformity as normalcy. This type of thing the ancients didn't believe in. And probably the most perfect structure that antiquity knew was the pyramid. The pyramid had several advantages. First of all, it was simple. It had no details. It had no structural peculiarities that would distort or clutter up the fine mathematical proportion. It was a perfect example of geometry. It was in all its parts balanced, orderly, methodical. It was exactly what it appeared to be, and it was in all ways suitable for the sacred purpose for which it was intended. So this type of building had the simplicity of an almost archetypal reality. What most people do not realize is that ultimately the universe is very simple. It is man who complicates it. The universe is a simple process unfolding in its own way and has always been a direct unfoldment of principles. Man, however, has confused the issue completely. He has distorted and rearranged things for his own pleasures with no consideration for their essential natures or the principles for which they were intended. Recently, in Java, on Indonesia, a restoration process has been used on the Great Pyramid and at Jakarta, known now as the Borobudur. This great Buddhist monument is another one of those mysteries. It is a pyramid. It is a perfect pyramid in a sense, but it represents a different philosophy of life. Therefore, it is presented with somewhat modified symbolism. Up to about 25, 30 years ago, this great monument, which is probably one of the largest religious structures on earth, was gradually fading away. The rock from which it was composed was weathering out of existence. The lack of adequate foundation was undermining its stability, and suddenly the world decided something should be done about it. So UNESCO started a program for the restoration of the Borobudur. And the job has been very, very well done at expense of many millions of dollars. But this great religious monument now stands as it was originally intended to stand. It is a pyramid that rises up through 7 levels, much like the ziggurat of Babylon and Chaldea. The upper or apex part of the pyramid of the Borobudur was a pagoda-like stupa or a reliquary with 2 rooms in it, which was empty. The restoration of it has never been able to find anything for that empty room. The building builds up to a symbol and then ceases. And this is the same thing that happens in the pyramid. The capstone of the pyramid is missing. The sacred relic that was supposed to be in the capstone or head of the Borobudur is also missing. So that all these things represent a certain unfinishedness, and it reminds us perhaps that in natural law and in the reactions within our own natures, everything that belongs to the material world is unfinished. Mortal existence, is an unfinished business. And it takes place in an unfinished world and challenges everything that lives here with the restrictions of an unfinished realization of truth. Everything is growing, but nothing has completed its growth. Everything is getting better, but nothing in the mortal world has finally achieved the state of being best. Everything we try to do, everything we try to work with, science particularly, should have a complete understanding of the mystery of the missing capstone. Because science is worrying over it right at the moment, but on a different level of thought. Everything that science discovers leads somewhere, but when it just about gets to the point where it looks as though it might tell us a great truth, it fades away. All visible things, if you trace them upward to their highest conditions, disappear. All of the intellectual achievements of the individual or of the great system of learning, this ascends from one level of genius to another, but the supreme genius has never been reached. The supreme answer to the problem of life has never been reached. All that we have for these particular conclusions is our own inward realization. So the formula is rather simple. We can build everything on the outside up to a point, but to complete it we must call entirely upon the inside. It is our own inner life that must perfect every structure that is formed in the material world. The answer to everything lies in ourselves. We can read books up to a certain point. We can use laboratory experiments up to a certain point. But somewhere along the line, as the alchemists learned, and they studied from the Alexandrian savants, these alchemists learned that the final ingredient of the transmutation was man himself, the internal part of his own nature. His own soul had to transform base metals into gold. Each individual soul must perfect the structure of his life, otherwise it will never be perfected. So to account for this, nearly every monument of importance in the world either has the top part missing or a bad scar in it, something imperfect, something that represents a flaw in the original purpose, because the completion of it must always depend upon the consciousness of the person beholding it. Otherwise, the secret cannot be perfected. Another interesting aspect of the pyramid problem has to do with the pattern of the Egyptian temple system. I think there's a good probability that somewhere there was some form of contact between the pyramid and one of the other temples of Egypt. This may have been, however, intentionally closed off at some time. This presents us with a very curious circumstance. The king's chamber in the pyramid, hidden within 200 feet of masonry in all directions, was originally ventilated. 2 air shafts went from the king's chamber in an upright diagonal motion to the surface of the pyramid. But when the capping stones and the casing stones were put in place, those air chambers, those air passageways, were sealed off. In other words, they come to the surface but are now covered, or were covered originally, by the casing stones. There was no aperture. They were not ventilated, but they were originally intended for ventilation. The answer seems to be, therefore, that something in there had to be alive and had to have air, although there is no clue to what it might have been. Of course, the present openings have nothing to do with the ancient design of the pyramid. Why should, for instance, would it be called the tomb of Hermes? What and who was Hermes? Hermes was the Greek form of the deity Mercury, and the Egyptian form of Mercury and Hermes was Thoth, the god of the writing tablet. Hermes was a symbol